Hello, my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute, a global futures and deep futures organization looking up to 50 years out. And in this particular presentation, which was originally given in London, I said to the Institute of Oil and Gas Producers, basically where we had senior executives basically from Shell, Exxon, Chevron, British Petroleum, and so on and so forth. What I talked about is the future of the energy economy. Now, when we think about a lot of different events, lots of different events basically will either talk about the importance of renewable energy, or basically they will be countering that basically with the importance of fossil fuels and everything else. It's very important to state from the offset that this presentation is a neutral and unbiased look at what the global energy future will actually look like, and ultimately where we're probably going to land in about 30, 40, 50 years' time. We're going to be taking a global view. We're going to be looking at all energy technologies. And so let's get to it. Now, when we actually look at the agenda, this is the agenda that I put in place. So we're going to be doing a quick introduction. I'm going to be talking through some comparisons. So these are sort of statistics and so on and so forth. We're going to look east. Now that does mean that we're going to be looking at what China's doing. That's it, because China is the dragon in the room. We're going to look at market shaping trends. We're going to be having a look at brand new energy business models, sort of a little bit of a quick look there. And then we're going to be having a look at the future of individual energy technologies. So this really is a fully fledged, fully rounded view of the global energy economy as it is today, tomorrow, and in 20 to 30 years' time. Now, when we think about the world, when we actually have a look around us, there's only one thing changing. We can all get our heads around one thing, surely, can't we? Unless that one thing is this. Because look around you and you will see geopolitics changing, you'll see societal behaviors changing, you will see technology changing, the environment changing, and so on and so forth. It's probably fair to say that there is nothing that isn't changing today. Now, this brings us on to this particular piece. In the 1970s, the United States military coined this phrase VUCA, which stood for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's a phrase that they used to describe the future as they were thinking about it. But today, basically, we have this new acronym that we've actually tagged on the end, MAX, because increasingly the changes that we are seeing are massive. They are system level. They are global in nature. If you think about the bipolar world that we find ourselves in, that is a global shift. When we actually think about the decoupling of the global economy, so the dominance of the US dollar being undermined by other currencies and other stable coins and digital currencies and so on and so forth, we are starting to see the global economy decouple. And for example, since we're talking about energy, a very good example of this is Saudi Arabian oil always used to be bought in dollars, but now it's being bought in rubles and yen, as well as basically the CNY. Now, this sort of decoupling of the world basically is affecting us at lots of different levels. We're seeing a technological decoupling, a cultural and ideological decoupling, a political decoupling. We're seeing, to different degrees, a military decoupling as well. When we think about energy, increasingly, basically, we're seeing a decoupling of different systems. So, for example, America is now under the president starting to lean much more basically back to coal, oil, gas than it is renewables. But actually, when you have a look east in China, it's driving full steam ahead, figuratively, into a future dominated by renewable electricity. And there's a couple of reasons for that, that's it, which the president actually called out, and actually I kind of agree with him on. So we'll go through that. Now, when we actually think about everything, the future is accelerating as well. It used to be the case that if you were a startup, for example, you had to have a large team around you, but increasingly now you need a small team to start your business, and you can scale globally much faster than you ever could before. In fact, you can disrupt the world in 69 milliseconds if you're actually an artificial intelligence company like OpenAI, because I released GPT-4, GPT-5, GPT-6, And 69 milliseconds later, that AI model and everything that it allows us to do is available to anyone basically with an internet connection and a smart device. The world is also exponential. Now, increasingly, when we think about exponential, we think about technologies. We think about artificial intelligence. We're seeing synthetic biology, which will actually play into this presentation as well, basically becoming an exponential technology. But also the speed of change is becoming exponential because, as I mentioned, release an AI model, 69 milliseconds later, I can use that to clone Microsoft if we're having a look at things like robo-programmers and robo-coders, basically as we see today. But that's a different talk. Now, from a global energy perspective, we're really starting to see the world kind of divide a little bit basically into kind of these two sort of states. We have petrostates, like for example Venezuela, like Saudi Arabia, the Middle Eastern countries and so on and so forth. But also now we have electrostates. So for example, Morocco. China could be considered broadly basically to be an electrostate. When we actually think about, for example, Finland, Norway and Sweden, they are increasingly electrostates. Even Norway, basically with its vast oil and gas reserves, is now leaning more on that sort of renewable energy bandwagon. And so this then sort of brings us to this. Increasingly, when we talk about, should we say, transporting energy around the planet, we are now transporting atoms, oil, gas, but also electrons. And we're going to be digging into these, both of these, in a lot more detail. Now, from a technology perspective, I track over 600 emerging technologies. Now, if you scan the QR code, you can get access to my 311 Institute Emerging Technology Codex, which covers technologies up to the year 2075. So we go, for example, when we talk about today's most sophisticated artificial intelligences, we already have liquid, chemical, and even DNA-based artificial intelligences that we've developed. So this particular radar goes up to 50 years out. It tracks 187 emerging technologies. But when we actually have a look at energy innovation, which is, where is it on the wheel? Here it is. It's the dark green one. There we go. When we have a look at the overall amount of innovation that we see across all of these 600 emerging technologies that I track, the three areas that really stand out in terms of volume are obviously intelligence, so artificial intelligence technology development, biotech innovation, but energy innovation as well. In fact, I would almost argue that today there is more energy innovation than anything else that we see from any other category of tech. And to sort of give you an example here, when we actually have a look at 50 years out, if I can actually get this pointer going right, yes, we've got things like cold fusion. So for example, we've actually seen the first example of cold fusion. Google's artificial intelligence about 4 years ago actually, this is DeepMind, actually said that cold fusion was actually theoretically possible. And now we've got a company that's actually doing it, albeit in the labs, got to be in the labs. We've got some technologies I'll talk about later. We've got things like gravity power plants, basically. So this is where we lift concrete blocks in Switzerland, basically up to very great heights, basically on a crane, and then drop it basically as a form of energy storage. So a little bit like grid scale storage, but in concrete form. Photovoltaics, I'm going to be talking through solar because there's some surprising things there. That's going to be later in this presentation. We've got polymer batteries and bacterial batteries that are coming through, quantum batteries. And just the other week, we actually put a quantum battery into a quantum computer. Now, quantum batteries are quite weird because they actually charge via the universe. You have to look them up. They are infinitely charged. So what they do is they use quantum mechanics theory to essentially become the infinitely charged, everlasting battery, outlasting nuclear batteries and all sorts of things. We've got quark energy. So quark energy was first discovered by the CERN Institute. It's a theoretical kind of fusion energy, but when we actually look at the numbers, the mathematics behind it, it's 8 times the power output of fusion that we haven't even developed yet. We've got solid state batteries. This is where we turn the structure of your car into a solid state into a sort of solid state battery and a structural battery. So for example, we can store electricity in the carbon fiber of your hypercar, like a Lamborghini Terzo Millennio, for example, and that car does not need traditional lithium ion batteries. Easy for me to say. We have thorium batteries or thorium reactors. Wireless energy, so doing lots on wireless energy at the moment. Basically, when we have a look at wireless energy transmission, we can now transmit energy across distances of around 5 kilometers, which changes how we start thinking about, should we say, grid infrastructure and transmission operators in the future, which is something I talked about in another video, which I'll put a little link into. And then we've got things like TWRs, traveling wave reactors, basically, which are, should we say, and I dare to say this, perfectly safe nuclear reactors which don't rely on water for cooling. But you know, the point of this is, as you can actually see from this, when it comes to energy innovation, we are still only just getting started. And I'm going to show you some amazing new energy innovations later on in this video. So we go around, let's go around and let's get on to the next slide. Now, when we think about the future of energy generation, energy storage, energy transmission, all these kinds of different things, I'm going to start here. I'm going to start talking about artificial intelligence. But it's not necessarily for the reason that you think. So, bearing in mind that I was talking to the world's largest oil and gas producers, you know, when they're thinking about the future of energy through their lens, basically they quite often think incrementally. You know, they think tomorrow will be slightly different to today, etc., etc. Now, today's artificial intelligence is like ChatGPT. ChatGPT has a verbal measured IQ of 155. Google Gemini 2.5 Pro had a measured IQ of 136. And while you can't necessarily directly compare an artificial intelligence's IQ with a human IQ, we like anthropomorphizing our technology. And these are sort of the comparisons that have been made. Now, as we start heading into 2026, 2027, we see a point in time where artificial intelligence has an IQ of about 300. But as we get to the point where we see either proto-AGI or full artificial general intelligence, we think those AIs could have an IQ of 1,600 and a billion times a billion times more general knowledge than any human. And that knowledge is not actually siloed, it's cross-domain. So why do we care? When we're talking about the future of global energy, why should we care about essentially a super intelligent AI? Well, it's because of this. When we combine highly sophisticated AI models with simulations, high-performance computing, let alone quantum computers, we are able to model new things almost instantaneously. So in this particular example, Google Gnome, which is G-N-O-M-E, took 35 million compounds, simulated them, brought them all together to try to develop new materials with particular characteristics and everything else. And at the end of 17 days, it had created and discovered 380,000 new materials. And these new materials have been put onto the US Department of Energy's materials open source database. Now, previously, throughout all of human history, we'd only discovered about 40,000 materials and put them onto this database. So this is a huge ramp. Now, if you think about things like energy transmission, superconductors, supercapacitors, if you think about, the technologies that we use to generate and store electricity, let alone transmit electricity, they're all reliant in different ways, basically, on materials. Lithium-ion batteries with different anodes and cathodes and so on and so forth. So if we've done everything that we've done today with sort of 40,000 material types, What can we do with another 380,000? We can change the game. I'm going to talk more about that later. Lots of little teasers at the start of this video. Now, the President of the United States a little while ago, along with European leaders, basically went on record and said, cheap energy is a strategic advantage. Now, I agree with this. So cheap energy is a strategic advantage because, for example, if you've got two identical car manufacturing facilities and the energy cost for one is free and the energy cost for another is, very, very high, then ultimately the car plant that has the cheapest energy will be able to undercut its rival and dominate the market. So both in the United States, the US is trying to get its cost of energy as low as possible. Same with China, but in two very different ways. Now, when we actually think about this basically from a global perspective, when I'm talking to, for example, the UK's National Grid and European leaders basically about this particular topic, I actually tend to add in cheap, sovereign, reliable energy is a strategic advantage. Because, for example, if we in the UK or in Europe get all of our cheap energy from Russia, and then all of a sudden there's a war and there's sanctions, our energy system is screwed. If we get our cheap energy from America and then the Americans put the price up, then the European economy is screwed because our cost of energy increases. Now, during the Russia-Ukraine war, at least at the start of the war, we saw liquid natural gas prices spike by 244%. So this is sort of why I say when we actually have a look at the future of energy, yes, cheap energy is a strategic advantage, but it's got to be secure, reliable, and sovereign. Because if we are producing cheap energy, for example, in the United Kingdom, then no one can really mess around with that. Sanctions won't necessarily hurt us in a way. We wouldn't just suddenly cut off our own energy generation systems. So this is sort of where I like trying to apply some different perspectives. Now, what we've seen historically is for every 10% increase in the cost of energy, the GDP of the country where we've seen this energy cost increase has decreased by 0.15%. So high energy costs reduce GDP growth. And you can see down here, that's it. So you can see the sources where I've got this information from. This is from Stanford. They did a big study on this if you want to go and dig into it. But we kind of all understand that cheap energy is a strategic advantage. And the more we pay for our energy, the less likely it is that we're going to be able to, should we say, grow our economies. And in fact, actually, our economies tend to shrink, which again is a problem in today's high energy price world. Now, when we actually have a look at reindustrialization, for example, the United States is reindustrializing, Europe is reindustrializing, etc., etc. Excuse me there. If you are reindustrializing your continent, so you're bringing manufacturing back to the continent and back from China typically, then ultimately you're going to want cheap energy. Now, when the cost of energy increased by 244%, the German government said that it was an existential threat to the German automotive groups like Volkswagen with the giant Wolfsburg plant. So if you want to reindustrialize your economies, you have to have cheap, reliable, secure, sovereign energy. Now, when we actually start having a look at some of the comparisons, basically, so what we're going to do here is we're going to have a look at some deep stats. So for this particular audience, what we did is basically we actually looked at the global view of energy. Now, when you have a look at the primary energy use at a global level, 81% of primary energy still comes from oil and gas. Because this also includes things like bunker fuel, basically for cargo ships and everything else. 19% of global primary energy came from nuclear and renewables. So when we think about the future is still heavily, heavily reliant on oil and gas, whether or not you like that. However, when we actually have a look at electricity generation specifically, the picture is obviously changing. Now, 60% of global electricity generation is coming from fossil fuels, so coal, oil, gas. 40% is now coming basically from renewables and nuclear. And you can see that realistically in the next couple of years, this is going to pass the 50-50%. And actually from an electricity perspective, we're going to be generating much more electricity from renewables and nuclear than we are basically from, for example, a gas peaker plant, etc. Now, another statistic that I gave the audience is this. Now, when we actually have a look at energy, kind of what we really care about when we're thinking about primary energy is we're thinking about energy, the energy density of the material or the generator device. Now, when we have a look at the amount of energy that's contained within a kilogram of petrol or diesel, roughly, it's 35 to 45 megajoules. Now, that energy density has increased by 3% in the past 100 years. So in 100 years, the energy density of petrol and diesel, etc., those kinds of fuels, has increased by 3%. Now, I argue basically that solar power and solar power generation is an exponential technology. And I'm going to sort of dig into this a little bit here, but also later on. When we have a look at the energy generation efficiency from solar over the past 20 years, not even the past 100 years, the energy efficiency of generating electricity from solar panels has increased by 40,000%. And we can see a much, much better future for solar in the future. And I'll explain. So today, basically, a traditional silicon solar panel will have an efficiency of about 21 to 27%. If we add Perscovite into the mix, so Perscovite solar panel, it's 32% energy efficient. If you include bacteria within a silicon solar panel, we get energy efficiency of 48% because we've done this and we've built these. If we actually put carbon nanotubes into a solar panel, basically then we can reclaim waste heat from the solar panel. That gives us an energy efficiency of 80%. Now, if we 3D print a nano material called black silicon, that has an energy efficiency for every photon hitting its surface of 132%. This is cannibalistic material, essentially. If we use quantum materials, we have an energy efficiency, because we've done this, of 191%. Now, if we put graphene on top of a solar panel, basically we can actually generate electricity from rain, from snow, etc., etc. In addition to that, if we actually use nanophotonic materials, we can generate enough energy basically from ambient light. We also have solar panels that generate electricity at night. So when we think of the solar panels that you're putting on the top of your house, those are the equivalent of cavemen ancestors to what we have in the labs. And even those are included in that 40,000% improvement in efficiency. So this is a today number, not a 2030, 2035 number, because that number you could probably add a zero to. Now, when we think about wind turbines, the amount of energy that we're able to generate from a wind turbine and the efficiency with which we can do it is 1,000% better than it was 20 years ago. And some of the wind turbines that we see today basically are 40 to 70 stories tall, and a single turbine can produce more electricity than can be used by 3 million homes. And we're only getting started. Now, when we think about batteries, we can 3D print batteries, we can use different materials, we can create air batteries, sulfur batteries, all sorts of different things, bacterial batteries, polymer batteries and everything else, the energy density of batteries as we kind of think of them today has improved by 700%, but it's still low. It's still at 0.25 megajoules per kilogram, which when you compare that to diesel, diesel wins hands down. However, look at the next one. So look at bioenergy. Now, when we think about bioenergy, basically these are things like biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels and everything else. However, again, synthetic biology itself is also an exponential technology. And when you actually have a look at bioenergy, for example, so bacterial energy or even algal sort of energy, where we're producing, for example, blue or green diesel, as it's actually called, it is already at the 42 megajoules per kilogram value. Now, with gene editing technologies like CRISPR, that number is only going to go up. So essentially, this is us genetically engineering bacteria and algae and other organisms to create incredibly dense or incredibly energy dense liquids, mediums, and so on and so forth. So when you really think about the future, basically from a diesel perspective, what happens basically when we can create a biofuel that has an energy density of 100 mJ/kg? So when we have a look at the future of energy, this is why it is not black and white. This is why when we think about the future of energy from a linear perspective, we're wrong. Because just in this example here, we have two energy technologies that are essentially in their own right exponential technologies, which diesel and petrol and bunker fuel are not. Now, when we think about global energy investment in 2025, let's say we saw $3.3 trillion invested in global energy. 2.2 trillion of that, actually rather neatly, 66%, basically was invested in renewables, infrastructure and nuclear. So that does include grid upgrades, transmission upgrades and so on and so forth. 1.1 trillion of that basically was actually invested in coal, gas and oil. However, on top of that 1 trillion figure, we actually had an estimated $1 trillion worth of subsidies actually given to the oil industry as well. So when we have to think about the future, today we see countries under more stress and strain than ever before because they're under huge amounts of public debt. We see this with France, we see this with the UK, we see this with the US with $38 trillion worth of debt, etc., etc., etc. So if we are subsidizing the oil and gas industry to the tune of $1 to $3 trillion, basically, which is sort of that's the sort of high-low watermark that we see on the numbers because, there's no specific reporting of these numbers, then at what point do these governments say, well, actually, we're going to subsidize the industry less and start pulling back? Because when that happens, energy economics changes again. Now, when we think about renewables, basically in 2024, 82% of all new energy generation capacity was renewables. 63% of that was in solar power. And then the rest of that was in wind, hydro, and other things. But 47% of global renewable investment was in China. And now when we actually think about the raw gigawatts, again, 2024, because these are when we have sort of full figures, we saw 82 gigawatts of new fossil generation capacity go online globally. But compare that to renewable, globally we saw 741 gigawatts of new renewable capacity going online. 445 gigawatts of that was in China. Where do you think China's going? And again, even though basically we've seen the political landscape shift significantly when it actually comes to the belief in net zero, ESG, renewables versus oil and gas, etc., this gap of 82 to 741 gigawatts, renewables have their own momentum. And it's going to be very, very difficult for any one country to disrupt that momentum. if not actually impossible. And I'm landing more on the impossible side. Now, when we actually think basically of China is doing a variety of different things. So the President of the United States sort of quite rightly said that the reason basically why China is so heavily pushing electric vehicles is because ultimately China is trying to produce more and more electricity to support those electric vehicles in whichever country they happen to be driving around in. And I'll come to that later. Now, when we actually have a look at the United States, last year the United States exported $318 billion worth of energy, principally oil and gas. Compare that with China, just $20 billion. Now, if you were the Chinese government, basically, you were actually thinking, well, energy basically is one of the most fundamental and most important things on the planet, and you're only exporting $20 billion worth of it, then where do you think the opportunity is? So I posit that the Chinese government is building up a huge energy generation capacity because ultimately they want to export that energy generation capacity to the rest of the planet. However it is done, we can discuss that in a bit. So China sees energy exports and therefore energy dominance in itself as a strategic imperative to help them grow GDP faster than they already are. So this is what the Chinese government does. So, because I work with the Chinese and I work with 70 governments basically around the world. And it's actually quite interesting when you compare how different governments behave between each other. So firstly, the Chinese government, even though it has a 5-year strategic plan, which it keeps producing obviously every 5 years, actually it has a 50 to 100 year planning horizon. Name any other country that has a 100-year planning horizon. So while we are trying to plan in Europe, for example, for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, China basically is planning for 100 years, and it's like a game of chess. They're moving a piece here and they're moving a piece there. And you look at them today and you just think, who cares? But in 20 years' time, you realize that the moves that China made today help them win the game over the long run. So in 2019, Chinese government basically announced the Global Energy Grid Program. Now, why do you think this is? We're playing the long game, remember. Now, if we connect all of the intercontinental grids together and you are generating electricity from renewables at a very, very low cost, bearing in mind that the cost of electricity generation in China is about $20 per megawatt hour from renewables. In Europe, it's about $40 per megawatt hour from renewables. And in the United States, it's about $60 to $100 per hour from renewables, but also from sort of traditional fossil fuel sources. If you have huge amounts of electricity generation capacity and you're producing energy cheaper than anyone else on the planet, and you would like to export that, what do you need? You need global energy grids. Now, when we actually start digging into some of the state media, Lu Xiang from the VP State Grid Corporation of China in 2019 said this. He said, essentially, China's ambitions basically for low-cost energy generation from renewables, but also the connecting together of global electricity and energy grids would culminate in this. An intercontinental ballistic missile for the global energy market. Now, what does he mean by that? It means that the chess pieces that China were starting to move in 2019 would ultimately mean that over the long run, China dominates the global energy system. Try to tell me I'm wrong. Now, in addition to that, China has been spending between $1 billion to $1.5 billion building out the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is where the Chinese government spend $1.5 trillion to build ports, infrastructure, buildings, and so on and so forth around the world. Because on the one hand, that allows them to extend their dominance basically into other countries. However, they're also building digital Silk Roads along that. So the digital Silk Road is where, for example, China might build a port basically in, say, Ghana, but they then say, well, because we've built your port, we would like you to actually use our 5G technologies, artificial intelligence platforms, quantum computing platforms, etc., etc. We'd like you to use our system integrators, our technology providers, and etc., etc. So China is building out a physical Belt and Road program. They're building out a digital Silk Road program. And on top of that, I think they're layering over an energy Silk Road as well. And we can see this basically with new energy plants that are being built. So, for example, nuclear energy plants that are being built across Africa, new transmission infrastructure that's being built across Africa as well as Latin America, and even actually in Italy and Europe as well as sort of the rest of Southeast Asia. These all start coming together. Name any other country that is doing any of these things. Now, in addition to that, Chinese companies go through a process called involution. Involution is essentially the absolute cutthroat equivalent, basically, of trying to beat your competitor to the lowest price point. And in fact, it's, I was going to say pissed off, might as well say pissed off. It's pissed off the Chinese Communist Party basically so much, basically, that increasingly Xi is actually telling people not to, it's actually telling companies as well as government procurement offices not to do it, because it's actually causing a deflationary environment in China. So this is essentially the race to the bottom. So what you have is you have companies in China with a 1.5 billion person domestic market that are all trying to produce whatever they produce at the cheapest price they can. Now, once they've produced things at the cheapest price they can, and we have an oversupply situation, where does all that cheap stuff go? It goes via exports, basically, to every other country, which is why we've seen China's exports now cross $1 trillion, despite tariffs, basically, from the United States. They are also trying to build out a program called the Little Giants program, or the Little Dragons program. They're sort of interchangeable. Now, this is where the CCP are trying to create 30,000 mid-sized companies that are never designed to go big. They're designed to sort of end up sitting at a revenue position of about, a couple of $100 million per year. But the purpose of these little dragons and these little giants is to dominate a specific part of a supply chain. So, for example, one little dragon company basically will be the best at creating computer chips for humanoid robots, and that's it. Another one might be the dominant provider globally, basically for a widget, basically for a super tanker, etc. Now, on the one hand, this is to try to protect the Chinese economy, basically from sanctions and blacklisting and those sorts of other behaviours, kind of give them skin in the game, like rare earths, as we've seen basically being used as a political football recently. But nevertheless, basically, this actually has implications on things like energy security, critical national infrastructure security, and so on and so forth. And the vast majority of governments basically don't know about this, but you do now. They also have rapid innovation. Now, it used to be the case that China was famous for copying whatever Western organizations did, like the F-35 fighter, you name it. But now, after the Made in China program that Xi put in place quite a number of years ago, what we're actually seeing is you have more and more Western organizations, including Ford, basically if we look at the automotive space, that are now looking to China as well as Meta and thinking, we're going to copy you. So when we think about rapid innovation, increasingly China is the company to copy and beat, not the one who's doing the copying. By 2045, China also wants to dominate all global standards. Now, a lot of people take this to mean technology standards, but it's not just technology standards, it's energy and green technologies as well. And in fact, if you have a look at Huawei, for example, 30% of all of the world's green patents are from Huawei. You didn't see that piece of insight coming, did you? Chinese companies basically also verticalize like crazy. So, for example, if you look at BYD, the electric vehicle company, they will also part own lithium plants and lithium mines in Chile and South America. So I also see this as a Chinese trend as well. So the Chinese government, as well as Chinese companies, have been buying, should we say, strategic parcels of resource and land. So for example, the CCP actually owns a lot of farmland in Africa. Why? Because they can grow crops in those parts of Africa, and then they can export those crops to China to feed a growing population. And food security. Now, when we actually think about resources, increasingly the Chinese will provide funding for your new cobalt mine, lithium mine, rare earths mine, but then they will provide everything on top of that, the processing facilities, the shipping and transportation, the financing, the whole lot. So verticalization is coming in through the front door and the back door as well. And actually, when you really dig into just how vertically integrated some of these Chinese companies actually are, it makes Apple look like a beginner. Now, as we move on, when we think about market shaping trends, these are some of the deeper dive stats. When we have a look at economic trends, we see blocks emerging. So it used to be the West and then the rest, North versus South, whatever it happens to be. However, under China, Russia and India, we see the BRICS Plus emerging. Now, when we actually think about the BRICS Plus, think about how much energy is controlled by the BRICS Plus. They control 44% of global oil output and 35% of global gas output. Now, in addition to that, when we think about the EAEU bloc, which is sort of Eastern Europe, but also a little bit more, they control 14% of oil and 21% of global gas production. That's it. So when you just think about these blocks, these economic blocks, when you take a step back and you look at the power and influence that these economic blocks actually have when it comes to energy production or resources, it's significant. So what would happen, for example, if the BRICS Plus said, you know what, we're not going to supply the United States with any oil and gas, or Europe, or anyone that we don't like. Now, when we have a look at global investment flows, investment in the low carbon economy, which does not necessarily mean renewable energy technologies, was 2.1 trillion last year. That was an increase of 11%. Now, investment in renewables was 623 billion, so about a quarter of that, the total sort of low carbon transition budgets. That grew at 8%. Now, that actually has slowed down as we've actually seen new policies coming through in the United States. However, 623 billion is still big. Now, when we think about the large global investment firms, a lot of them have actually pulled back some of their investments in renewable energy, sort of generation technologies, simply because of, should we say, the slight political weaponization of ESG in the US. However, when we actually start having a look at some of the other, should we say, complementary sectors, investment in electric vehicles in 2024, this is, surged 36% to $364 billion. Now, if you combine the investment in electric vehicles and renewables, that's now taking that to about $1 trillion. Now, if we think about trying to slow down the renewable energy transition, and all of a sudden we have more and more electric vehicles throughout the planet, US being generally a bit more of an exception, then at what point does the rest of the planet drive around in an electric vehicle while, for example, in America, driving around maybe more in a diesel or petrol vehicle? So this is sort of where we start to see some of these sort of splits occurring, globally. Now, in terms of demand, in 2025, for this particular stat, we saw global energy demand in 2025 increase by 2.2%. Now, between 2013 and 2023, the global average was about 1.2 to 1.3% energy demand increase. So this 2.2% increase in energy demand, which is the primary supply, it represents a 69% increase. That's unheard of. And that actually caught quite a lot of the oil and gas majors by surprise. Now, when we actually think about basically the overall loads, basically just in the United States, predominantly because of the build out of artificial intelligence data centers, in the US, basically that electricity demand is now increasing by 4.3% annually, but the forecasts have moved from 23 gigawatts to 128 gigawatts basically of electricity demand by 2030. Now, when we think about environmental trends, because basically the environment is not going anywhere. Now, in 2024, 2025, we saw the 1.5 degrees Celsius barrier being broken. And with some of the oil majors that I actually talk to, basically they still say that it hasn't been broken yet. However, when we actually have a look at the science and the research, basically it shows that actually on average it has. But either way, we're very close to that 1.5, and we're either above it or below it, depending on which organization you're talking to. But last year, basically, we saw 37.8 gigatons of CO2 being emitted. However, the amount of CO2 that's being emitted in Europe fell. The amount of CO2 being emitted in China has also just fallen for the first time. So actually, when it comes to reversing the amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that are actually being emitted into the Earth's atmosphere, renewable energy is actually making a difference, and we're actually seeing it turning up in the numbers now. Now, as we saw, for example, the weaponization to different degrees by ESG, that's it, we actually saw 28% more cities embracing net zero targets in 2024 compared to 2023. We saw 23% more companies embracing net zero and 8% more regions embracing net zero. So that all sounds kind of good. However, only 16% of all those net zero policies are actually anywhere near on track. Which then kind of brings us to the point of, well, you know, you talk a good game, but your actions kind of suck. But then again, it's one thing to actually make the pledge, but then you have to invest in the infrastructure, the energy transition to support that pledge. And that takes time, it takes capital, and it takes a lot of resources and effort. Now, when we look at geopolitical trends, I mean, we could spend a lot of time on geopolitical trends. 5 companies control 60% of the lithium and 56% of the cobalt output. Now, this has sort of been flagged basically geopolitically basically as a security risk. And it's one of the reasons basically that's sort of being used to try to temper the electric vehicle transition, you know, for a whole variety of different reasons. However, when we actually think about lithium-ion batteries in the United States, Europe, and Japan, we have been creating new batteries that don't rely on lithium or cobalt. That's it. So it's all very well controlling 60% of the world's lithium supply, but if we don't need lithium for lithium-ion batteries any longer because they are metal-less batteries, and there's lots of other sort of battery types we could talk about, who cares? But also 75% of oil output is state controlled as well. And we actually saw Venezuela recently sort of being invaded. That's it. So, you know, Venezuelan oil basically is a prime example of state controlled oil output. Now, when we think about energy security, we saw outages in Europe a little while ago, basically. So this was actually just before I was giving one of my other talks on the future of energy regulation and European energy security, which I'll put in the links below. But as I said before, 96 out of 130 countries are net importers of their primary energy supply. So it's all very well having access to cheap energy, but if the provider of that cheap energy suddenly says, no energy for you, no oil and gas for you, whatever it happens to be, you're crippled. Your economy is dead in the water. So this is why I say cheap energy is one thing, but safe, secure, reliable, sovereign energy is a must. And this is where I encourage most of the governments that I actually work with to go to, and actually most of them are. Because as soon as you say sovereign and you kind of talk about these kinds of slides in this kind of context, they go, yeah, sovereign energy, you're right. So 74% of the world's population depends on energy from other countries. That's a lot. And when we actually look at renewables, renewables allow you to generate electricity within your own borders in different ways, which then mean, provided it is generated and transmitted within your own borders, you are minimally reliant on other countries for your energy supply. And actually, in some cases, outside of maybe bunker fuel, aviation fuel, those kinds of things, as we've seen with Cuba, you don't care who's messing about basically with primary energy sanctions. Now, from societal trends, now when we actually think about Shell, so Shell produce a 5-year forecast, and the reason why some of these slides in here is because they actually care about, for example, the digitization of the world when it comes to energy consumption as well. So I'm going to break some of these down here. So this is sort of why some of these might look a little bit odd, but this is actually lining up with Shell's sort of strategic vision. Now, when we have a look at 2030, by 2030 there are going to be 5.4 billion, with a B, middle class people. About 1.5 billion of those basically are actually going to be in Southeast Asia. And Southeast Asia has the greatest ramp up. Now that's 65% of the population, but also by 2030 it represents about $63 trillion worth of consumption. And out of that $63 trillion worth of consumption, about $16 trillion of that consumption is going to come from millennials and Gen Z. Now, when I talk to European governments, one of the first things we often talk about is how do we grow GDP? Because as Europe, basically we are stagnating. So when you actually have a look at all of the G7 and 18 of the G20, excluding China and India, 18 of the G20 are now experiencing sub 2% GDP growth. Now, in 2025 and 2026, in 2026 especially, basically, it looks like the American administration wants to drive American GDP to between 5 to 6%. That's it. So we'll end up with 17 countries in the G20, basically, that are sub 2%. Now, the problem that this presents is if you have more public debt than ever before and GDP growth is flatlining, then you end up having to tax your citizens more. So that gives you a political problem, a societal problem, a cost of living problem, but also it means that from a disposable income perspective, disposable incomes are only going to grow by about 0.1%. Now that's a problem because if your disposable income is growing by 0.1%, and average, for example, Eurozone inflation rates are between 2 to 4%, then you're losing purchasing power, which means you're buying fewer goods. Now, if you're buying fewer goods, basically then you're importing fewer goods. And if you're importing fewer goods, basically then the amount of fuel that a Maersk or a Hapag-Lloyd need basically for their gigantic cargo ships actually reduces. So this all sort of has an impact basically on the amount of primary energy that's used, as well as electricity generation. Because if I'm getting poorer as an individual, I'm going to try to use less energy to heat my house, not more. Now, when we think about talent volumes, basically in the energy industry, in the global energy workforce, we estimate there are about 67 million people. 50% of those are in low carbon sectors. So low carbon includes things like carbon capture storage, low emission extraction, basically of oil and gas and so on and so forth. But 40% of all renewable jobs are actually in China. That's it. But despite this, we still have a talent shortage of about 2.5 million people for the energy sector globally. And that's why we see so many training programs actually coming through. And in fact, increasingly, the thing that's holding back the renewable energy transition isn't necessarily investment or the ability basically to buy and build giant wind turbines and transmission cabling and everything else. It's actually we don't have enough people to actually physically install the stuff. Now, when we think about technological trends, AI, we've all been talking about AI data centers. And in fact, basically when I was talking to the Shell chief economist, I said, you know, we actually, and it's a fun story. A lot of large energy giants basically are pegging their futures and the future of their share prices and investments on AI data center energy growth. So last year we saw $600 billion being invested in the development of new AI factories, as NVIDIA calls them, with energy use just in the AI sort of sector expected to double by 2030, an increase of 44% to 945 terawatt hours. Now, realistically, when you have a look at, say, the Stargate project from the United States, it uses about 300 to 400,000 NVIDIA Blackwell GPUs, or it will. It's a 10 gigawatt data center. And to put that into perspective, it will need 10 nuclear power stations to power it. We're seeing a 5 gigawatt data center outside of Abu Dhabi. We're seeing 2 gigawatt data centers in Europe, etc., etc. Now, if you were an organization like Google, and Google are actually one of my customers on the AI side of the fence, do you really want to be paying $250 to $750 million a year, basically, for your energy? No. So while everyone is forecasting these huge energy demands, the fact of the matter is, when you have a look at China are developing AI models basically that are just as good as their Western counterparts, except for the fact they use anywhere between 10 times, so that's 10 times, not 10%, 10 times to 1,000 times less energy. We're also developing basically new energy efficient computer chips like analog computer chips. The University of Oxford has developed new algorithms which help train AI models using 4,000 times less energy than they do today, etc., etc. And here's the rub. So while the energy giants are forecasting the energy consumption for the AI sector to do this, the reality of it is a lot in the industry, especially Google DeepMind, as well as Chinese organizations, are trying to develop AIs basically that are much more efficient and cost effective to train. So AI energy growth could do, it probably still do this, that's it, but not this. Now, if you're a company like Shell and you're investing for this, you're going to end up with oversupply capacity. But again, this is sort of where it's very interesting to see the reaction of people when you're talking to them about this sort of stuff and saying, we can already see companies that are desperately trying to reduce the amount of energy that training an AI model actually consumes. Even to the point where NVIDIA, for example, are trying to develop photonic GPUs, and they use 30% less energy. And actually in China, basically Huawei has already developed photonic GPUs, which are horribly energy efficient, let alone analog computer chips, which you can read up on my website. So when we look at AI, huge amounts of energy growth or energy demand growth basically is sort of being pegged to the AI industry, but it's not as simple as a lot of people think. And I know that because I'm in the animals basically that are actually talking about these things. And then you have Sam Altman. Sam Altman, for example, is quite clearly saying, in fact, he has said this on record, electrons are the new oil, in which case we're looking at renewable energy generation, not oil and gas energy generation, basically certainly for a lot of open AIs, basically AI factories and data centers. Although when we have a look at Elon Musk, basically with the Colossus data center, that's actually using gas, as well as renewable energy and so on and so forth. That's predominantly just to get these factories online quicker. Now, when we think about the security of national infrastructure, but also the global energy industry, 6 months ago, we saw the development of the world's first fully autonomous agentic cyber weapons. So these were cyber weapons that were given a target. They then understood what that target was. They chained together loads of zero-day exploits and then went off to attack those targets. Now, in that case, those targets basically were military targets, so military-grade security targets, and they cracked 52% of them, but they did so in 2 minutes. So when we actually have a look at the cyber vulnerability that the industry faces, that's going off the charts. Now, from a digitization perspective, so Shell's global energy forecasts actually take digitization into account when they're thinking about energy consumption. Now, on average, the average digital employee, which essentially is an employee that uses a lot of digital tools to do their work, uses the equivalent of 3.89 tons of oil equivalent, TOE. Now, the WEF predicts that over the next sort of 3 years, we'll have 78 million more people that are going to be digital employees, and that's going to add 303 million tons of oil equivalent in energy consumption. And it's also potentially going to add another 2% to global total energy supply. Now, when we start having a look at some of the trends outside of the oil and gas industry, Elon Musk, basically with Starlink, so he now has 14,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, expects to add another 500 billion to the connected world by 2030. Now, if all of these people, if you have 500 billion people that are now suddenly connected to the internet, bearing in mind a lot of people in Africa, Latin America, even North America, 20% of people in North America don't have a reliable internet connection, then what does that now do to the number of digital workers that we actually see? So by bringing this slide in, all of a sudden we see that actually the amount of tons of oil equivalent as a total could actually increase substantially, because we might not have 78 million new digital employees. We could have whatever, but we could have up to 500 million. I need to change that. We could have 500 million more people actually coming through as digital employees. Now, when we have a look at business models, so consider this. If you have an electric vehicle and the electric vehicle has a flexible solar panel basically on top, as we see with Hyundai, Lightyear 1, Toyota, that electric vehicle can generate its own electricity. The vehicle is a micro electricity generator. Now, if you take BMW technology, when your car is generating its own electricity, so it doesn't necessarily need to connect to the grid any longer, and it certainly doesn't need oil and gas. Remember China, it doesn't need oil and gas now. As your car generates electricity for itself, it can now transmit surplus energy using wireless conductive technology to cars, trucks, as well as infrastructure around it. So now BMW becomes the energy distributor, Hyundai become an energy generator as a company. These companies have a new revenue stream which can, if they scale it properly, do it properly and everything else, could start actually disrupting the oil and gas giants, certainly in the transportation space. When we think about Tesla, most electric vehicles at the moment have a queen-sized mattress full of lithium-ion batteries basically just beneath the chassis. So in Tesla's case, Tesla in the UK, as well as parts of Europe and also in California in the US, have registered as a virtual power plant company because they can now feed the electricity from that tied grid storage, basically in that electric vehicle, back to the grid to act as a form of battery backup or battery boost when the grid actually needs more electricity than traditional sources can supply. But now, basically, when we think about BYD, when we think about Tesla, that's it. They can also do energy brokerage. So now they're an energy trading company. And in fact, in the UK, I can buy my electricity directly from Tesla. And I can also buy my electricity for my house direct from BYD, not Centrica or RWE or SSE, etc., etc. So this is where clever companies with visionary leaders are able to identify new market opportunities and move into those market opportunities before the incumbents, the electricity generators, transmission providers, as well as energy retailers in this case, actually know there's a new player in town. And then when we think finally about the energy technologies, so we're now kind of coming to a close, so thank you for your attention this far. I know it's a long one, but hopefully it's been worth it. When we think about nuclear fusion, Sam Altman and lots of other futurists, kind of like me, say fusion is round the corner. No, it isn't. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. So yes, basically we are breaking fusion records left, right and center. Yes, Google has just forward ordered 200 megawatts basically of fusion from Commonwealth Fusion. However, we still do not have a working fusion plant. When we do get a working fusion plant, it's got to be tested, regulated, vetted, approved. Once it is vetted and approved, we're going to have to build a second fusion plant, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth, then a sixth. Scaling out a fusion plant or building an individual fusion plant will take about 5 to 10 years. Getting the capital to build out fusion plants around the world, that's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar effort. So for everyone, including Sam Altman, that says fusion is almost here, fusion will save us, fusion is the future of clean energy, you're looking at 2050. It's going to be a very, very long time in the future when I can go to a company and say, I would like to buy the energy for my house from your fusion plant, please. Even though we are making great strides. Now, when we think about geothermal, basically in Japan, as well as Google, basically through Google X, have developed new hypersonic drilling technologies that allow us to drill down into the Earth's mantle 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper than ever before. And in fact, geothermal energy is now scaling faster, especially basically in northern territories, than anywhere else on Earth. And in the UK, we even have universities that actually have their own geothermal plants. So for example, Sheffield Hallam University, its electricity, energy, is derived from geothermal. And we also think that if you look at Yellowstone, for a little fun fact, NASA was actually thinking about turning Yellowstone into a 6 gigawatt geothermal plant. Now, when we think about hydrogen, we have lots of different colors of hydrogen. You've got gray hydrogen, which is from liquid natural gas. You've got blue hydrogen. You've got gold hydrogen, basically, which is bacteria that's pushed down into the oil wells, basically to sort of reclaim basically the last remnants of oil, basically in an oil well. When we think about green hydrogen, the cost of green hydrogen is still about 3 to 5 times higher per litre basically than blue hydrogen, which is actually the one from natural gas. Grey hydrogen is from traditional fossil fuels. Now with green hydrogen looks like its development is actually accelerating and the costs are dropping quickly because guess what? Artificial intelligence has been designing new single-step low energy catalysts, which means we can actually now create hydrogen using less energy than ever before and faster than ever before. Now, when we think about nuclear, we've got floating nuclear reactors on cargo ships. Why? Because the planning regulations for a new nuclear reactor, for example, in the United States or Europe, takes between 5 to 10 years to get planning applications. But if you have a reactor on a ship, the concept is that you can just plug your nuclear reactor into an input at a port and you don't actually need planning permission for your ship because your ship just docks, plugs in, it's like a backup battery, plugs into the grid, and all of a sudden you've got 1.2 gigawatts being provided to the grid. Now, when we think about nuclear, the world's biggest nuclear reactor is currently being built in China, and it is a 7.2 gigawatt monster. So China is actually leading in the generation and development of new nuclear platforms. But in addition to that, we've got companies like Nucor, NuScale, as well as Rolls-Royce in the UK that are developing mini nuclear reactors. So these mini nuclear reactors are anywhere from sort of about 250 megawatts to about a gigawatt. And some of them actually fit into a container. And in some cases, those containers are actually now being put outside AI data centers just as a form of battery backup. So mini nuclear reactors, we estimate the amount of electricity being generated by nuclear to triple to 2040. Now in China and India, we've seen the development of thorium reactors. So thorium reactors have been positioned in northwest China. And the reason why thorium reactors are interesting to the Chinese is because you don't need water to cool them, which means you can put a thorium reactor in the middle of a desert. And so China 2 years ago actually built the first prototype thorium reactor in the northwest of China, and actually it works. Then you've got traveling wave reactors backed by guys like Bill Gates. Now, a TWR basically is a nuclear reactor that burns spent nuclear fuel. That's it. So if you think about nuclear fuel waste that's all over the place, there's about $600 billion worth, it's estimated, of waste nuclear fuel. You pop that into your TWR reactor and off you go. And it's a little bit like burning a candle. You know, as you burn the candle, it just gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And then once you've burned the candle out, that's it. But TWRs are quite interesting because they are supposedly completely safe. And they also aren't water cooled, like we saw with Fukushima. Part of the problem we had with Fukushima basically is the water cooling system broke basically when the earthquake hit. Now, oceanic. Now we can take ocean seawater, and because it contains hydrocarbons, we can convert that into green diesel. So this is diesel that is literally made from seawater, not from crude oil. We've got osmotic power plants in Japan, basically, which generate electricity from the transfer of molecules between seawater and fresh water, so the pressure gradient in the middle. We've got tidal. Now, when we think about tidal, basically, we've also got oceanic tidal. And then we've got deep sea turbines. Now, when we think about deep sea turbines, the Japanese, especially Hitachi, basically been very, very good. And what they've done is they've put deep sea turbines at about 200 feet down on the seabed. And the Japanese estimate from these deep sea currents, they could generate 250 gigawatts of electricity forever. So when we actually have a look at deep sea turbines, these are the turbines that sit in the deep sea ocean bed, and the currents basically sort of whip through them. That's something a lot of people aren't seeing, but you do now. Solar, I've discussed this. We've already got solar panels that work 24/7. You can start forgetting lithium-ion grid-scale storage basically as we move into the future, because solar basically is an exponential technology. We've also got solar panels that already work in ambient light. We've also got solar panels that generate electricity from moonlight. So remember this phrase, solar is an exponential technology. It is not incremental. If any energy source or any energy generation capacity or any kind of new energy generator is going to surprise you in efficiency gains, it's going to be solar, and then obviously biofuels as well. And speaking of which, basically the Chinese basically have now moved from gene editing to chromosome engineering. Now this is the equivalent of CRISPR being a gene editing tool which can edit individual sentences in your genome, to a chromosome engineering system which can edit entire chapters. So the Chinese, not that I'm seeing much evidence of it, could use chromosome engineering to outcompete the West when it comes to the development of sustainable aviation fuel, biofuels, and all those sorts of other things. Bearing in mind that earlier I talked about biofuels having an energy density rivaling diesel and petrol of 42 megajoules per kilogram. Then we have space. Now, there's a lot of talk about orbital space data centers and everything else. If you put a solar panel in space, then it's 3 times more efficient, basically, than a solar panel on the ground. And then we use microwave or laser beams, basically, to actually transmit that energy from space down to a ground-based substation, and then that gets distributed in the normal way. However, with a space-based platform, you can suddenly just change basically where you're actually sending that power. So when Texas basically lost most of its energy grid a couple of years ago, you could literally have just rejigged a solar-based power station. So rather than it sending energy to a base station in, say, California, it sends it to an energy base station in Texas. Now, the Chinese want to build a 1 kilometer long solar array, but the engineering involved is staggering. The UK government has invested $16 billion. The American military, as well as Carnegie Mellon University and a couple of others, have already trialed different space-based energy generation platforms. Kind of call them a space-based power station. I don't know, they haven't really got a proper name. But now, basically, with orbital data centers that are being pitched by Google, Elon Musk, Nvidia, Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin, increasingly the race for space-based power generation is literally going to the moon. So this is a fun one to watch. This is sort of science fiction come incarnate. The first space-based power stations were first theorized about in the 1960s. Then we've got wind. Now, wind, increasingly, basically, we've got wind turbines that are sort of near shore. So we can see them basically when we're sort of on the beaches and everything else. And everyone goes, oh, I don't like wind turbines. They look horrible and they kill birds. However, both in Europe, basically with companies like Ørsted, as well as China especially, as well as Siemens Energy, basically we are now seeing the development of deep ocean wind turbines. Now, these wind turbines aren't anchored to the seabed. They're actually pretty much anywhere out at sea. You could put them in the middle of the Atlantic, and provided the cables reach, then that's fine. However, when we actually think about wind energy generation, basically there's a new sort of Japanese sort of trend that's upticking. You could actually create an offshore deep ocean wind farm, and it's not connected at all to the land. So no cables, no grids under the ocean. And what they've been doing in Japan, and what they've been building out in Japan, is you essentially have the equivalent of an oil cargo ship. And it sits by these deep ocean wind turbine farms, and they power batteries on this cargo ship. And then the cargo ship literally is, in much the same way we export oil, just brings those batteries on shore, plugs in, and then transmits energy to the grid in that way, like a tide grid storage kind of thing. So this is sort of where we actually see the oil and gas industry and wind industry actually kind of sort of meeting in this weird sort of hybrid space where, you know, today, companies like Shell and BP might actually have an oil cargo ship or oil cargo ship, but tomorrow that same ship might contain lots of lithium-ion batteries. And then also the size of these wind turbines is getting huge. As I said, they're 70 stories tall now, and the Chinese have just come out with a double-headed wind turbine, which is the biggest in the world. And that single wind turbine generates enough electricity to power 3 million homes. So when you now think about the cost of electricity generation, the cost of electricity generation from renewable sources, especially solar, when we extrapolate it out into the future, we can see it dropping to zero, or very, very close to $0 per kilowatt hour or $0 per megawatt hour. So this is the killer, really. When you think about traditional oil and gas, it has a fixed It has fixed unit economics. When we think about wind, and especially solar, as well as SAF to a degree, as well as maybe green hydrogen and these other things, we are only just getting started on the economics of those. Now, if I could use solar to generate electricity at almost zero cost, when your country is generating electricity or using energy at a cost of $40 to $120 per megawatt hour, I win. And that's really what China is doing. That's where China is going. And that's where Europe's trying to follow amidst all of the different sort of geopolitics that are actually going on. And that's it from me. So thank you very much basically for listening to little old me. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like this one, check out some of the other videos. Basically, I've got videos on the future of absolutely everything you can imagine. And it's been wonderful being able to share these insights with you. So thank you very much for your attention. Take care. Have a great day. Goodbye.